Late winter, 1944. A U.S. POW camp, somewhere in the American Midwest. The wind cuts through the barbed wire fences like a knife. A gray sky hangs low, pressing down on rows of wooden barracks. The war in Europe is still raging, but here, thousands of miles away, the sounds are different. No artillery, no Luftwaffe overhead, only the distant hum of trucks and the rustle of dry leaves against uniform boots. Inside the processing hall, a group of German medical personnel stands in silence. Mostly nurses in faded field uniforms, their Red Cross armbands dulled by months of dirt and retreat. Their faces carry the exhaustion of the collapsing Reich. An American guard hands each prisoner a small brown square wrapped in crinkled foil and paper. One nurse, perhaps in her 20s, turns it over in her hands, confused. It's smooth. It smells faintly of cocoa, a smell many of them have not known since childhood, if ever. She breaks off a piece and places it on her tongue. Her eyes widen. Not bitter, not stale, but rich, creamy, impossibly sweet. Around her, murmurs ripple through the group. Some laugh softly. Others simply stare as if tasting another world. For these German POW nurses, this was their first Hershey's chocolate, and with it, their first tangible encounter with the industrial abundance of the United States. It was a moment small in scale, but vast in meaning. Because to understand that square of chocolate, one must understand the world that led them here. In the early years of the Second World War, the role of German nurses expanded far beyond hospitals and civilian clinics. As Hitler's armies swept through Europe between 1939 and 1941, tens of thousands of young women were drawn into the military medical apparatus. They wore crisp field uniforms with Red Cross armbands and were deployed to frontline aid stations, mobile surgical units, and military hospitals from the fields of France to the forests of the Eastern Front. For many of these women, nursing had been a patriotic calling. In Nazi Germany, the profession was tightly bound to ideology. Training was rigorous but heavily propagandized, blending genuine medical skill with a sense of duty to the fatherland. Their work was brutal. They treated the shattered bodies of soldiers returning from the front, often in field tents under bombardment with little more than morphine and gauze. By 1942, as Operation Barbarossa stretched German forces deep into the Soviet Union, these nurses were stationed in some of the most unforgiving environments of the war. The bitter winters turned supply lines into frozen graveyards. Field hospitals operated with intermittent electricity, limited antibiotics, and constant fear of Soviet counterattacks. Nurses worked sleepless nights amputating limbs, disinfecting wounds with alcohol when nothing else remained, and improvising surgeries in collapsing wooden barracks. In the West, after the D-Day landings in June 1944, the rapid Allied advance pushed German medical units into retreat. Many nurses who had followed the Wehrmacht through occupied France suddenly found themselves trapped in encirclements as American and British forces broke through. The once confident medical corps was forced into emergency evacuations, moving wounded soldiers by train or truck under constant aerial bombardment. Supplies ran out. Civilians and nurses alike were often left behind as the front collapsed. As Allied troops advanced toward Germany, the number of captured German medical personnel soared. Entire hospital trains were intercepted. Field units were surrounded. Unlike combat troops, medical staff were usually not executed or summarily mistreated. They were considered protected personnel under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Captured nurses were processed as prisoners of war, though their treatment differed from frontline soldiers. Many were transported across the Atlantic, sent to the United States to alleviate overcrowded camps in Europe. The decision to bring German prisoners, including medical personnel, to American soil was a logistical operation on a massive scale. Beginning in 1943 and peaking after Normandy, the U.S. Army shipped over 400,000 Axis POWs to camps scattered across the American interior. These camps were often located in quiet rural states: Texas, Iowa, the Dakotas, the Midwest, far from any battlefront. The climate and isolation made escape nearly impossible. For the German nurses, many of whom had never left Europe, the voyage across the Atlantic was disorienting. They boarded crowded troop ships under guard, crossed submarine-infested waters, and disembarked into a country they had been taught to fear. Nazi propaganda had portrayed the United States as chaotic, degenerate, racially mixed and militarily weak. What they found upon arrival was something very different. A land untouched by bombing, with stable infrastructure and a level of industrial output they could barely comprehend. Their uniforms were confiscated, their names recorded. They were issued POW clothing, often ill-fitting khaki overalls marked PW, and sent by train to inland camps. Along the way, they glimpsed American towns through the train windows. Rows of clean houses, shiny automobiles, grocery stores with bright signs and queues that moved quickly. Everything seemed abundant, stable, organized. For women who had spent years surrounded by shortages, rubble, and retreat, these images made a deep impression. It was in this environment, a foreign land, their nation crumbling behind them, that they would encounter something that seemed almost magical. A simple bar of Hershey's chocolate. The American POW camp system was unlike anything most Axis prisoners had imagined. By late 1944, more than 500 camps were scattered across the United States. They were built quickly, often on the outskirts of small towns, surrounded by barbed wire and wooden guard towers. The majority were not high-security fortresses, but orderly, regimented compounds where discipline was firm yet predictable. For German medical personnel, the experience was far from the brutal imagery they had been led to expect. Inside the camps, routines were strict. Roll calls were taken at dawn, work assignments distributed, and meals served at set times. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel retained certain privileges. Nurses were not treated as combatants. Many worked inside the camp infirmaries, assisting American medical staff with fellow prisoners or performing clerical work. Others were assigned to agricultural labor, helping with the wartime labor shortage in rural communities. What struck many of them most was the quality and quantity of food. Even though the United States was rationing to support the war effort, its agricultural abundance was enormous compared to Europe. POWs were given meals that followed U.S. Army standards. Bread was soft and plentiful. Meat appeared regularly. Coffee was served hot. And on occasion, special items appeared that no German soldier or nurse had tasted in years: fruit, canned goods, and sweets. Among these rations was something uniquely American: Hershey's chocolate. Since the late 1930s, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation in Pennsylvania had worked closely with the U.S. military to develop specialized chocolate bars for soldiers. These were not luxury items, but rations engineered to be compact, calorie-dense, and resistant to melting. The first, known as the D ration, was a hard, bitter bar designed to provide energy without encouraging soldiers to eat it as candy. Later, the tropical bar was developed to withstand the heat of the Pacific. By 1944, millions of these bars were rolling off Hershey's assembly lines every day. For American troops, chocolate was both nourishment and comfort. It was included in K rations, dropped to paratroopers, and tucked into soldiers' pockets before battle. It carried with it a sense of home, a reminder of civilian life far from the front. When German POWs, including nurses, entered American camps, the military sometimes distributed these same rations during intake processing or on special occasions, in part to comply with convention standards, in part to maintain order through fair treatment. The cultural shock was immediate. In Germany by 1944, sweets had become a distant memory. Sugar was rationed to the bone. Cocoa imports had ceased years earlier, diverted to essential industries or cut off entirely by Allied blockades. Ersatz chocolate made from barley, beet syrup, or ground chestnuts was the only substitute. Even for civilians, a sweet treat was rare. For nurses who had spent years in field hospitals and bombed cities, real chocolate was something almost mythical. Reports and memoirs from both sides capture the moment vividly. American guards often observed the puzzled looks when prisoners received their first bars. Some thought it was medicine. Others tried to break it with knives, not realizing it would melt in their mouths. There were accounts of German nurses laughing in disbelief, passing pieces around, remarking on its softness and sweetness. A few even asked if such chocolate was reserved for officers, unable to imagine it was standard fare for ordinary soldiers. For the U.S. military, this was not an act of kindness so much as an extension of its logistical machine. The American war effort operated on a scale unlike anything Germany could match. The same industrial force that produced Liberty ships and Sherman tanks produced endless streams of food, clothing, and candy. For the prisoners, the chocolate was a symbol, not of luxury, but of a system so vast and efficient that even its prisoners experienced abundance. As the nurses settled into camp life, this realization grew sharper. They saw American trucks arrive on schedule, watched well-fed guards rotate shifts, and witnessed a society that functioned without the shortages and chaos they had left behind. And each time a piece of chocolate appeared, it was a reminder of the contrast between the collapsing Reich and the industrial powerhouse that now held them. It is here, at this intersection of logistics, culture, and human experience that the story deepens. Different angles reveal what this moment truly represented, not just for those who tasted it, but for the world watching the war reach its final chapters. Before the war, most of these German nurses had grown up in a country where sweets were rare but deeply cherished. In the 1930s, Germany still had small confectioners, regional chocolates, and seasonal treats tied to holidays. But once war began, rationing took hold swiftly. Sugar, butter, and imported cocoa became luxuries redirected toward the war machine. By the early 1940s, many young women in uniform had not tasted real chocolate in years. Their daily reality was ersatz goods, substitutes made from roasted grains, saccharin, and other improvised ingredients. The sweetness of childhood became a fading memory. Their emotional world was shaped by scarcity and propaganda. Nazi ideology promoted sacrifice, self-discipline, and the idea that true Germans would endure hardship for the fatherland. Posters and radio broadcasts celebrated rationing as patriotic. Children were taught to see treats as rewards for loyalty, not common goods. For nurses working at field hospitals, there was little space for indulgence at all. They lived in a rhythm of exhaustion, surrounded by blood, mud, and relentless demands. When that first square of Hershey's chocolate melted on their tongues, it wasn't just a taste they encountered. It was a forgotten sensation from a different life. It carried them briefly out of the war's brutal logic. Technologically, Hershey's chocolate represented something entirely foreign to the German wartime experience. In the United States, food production had become a branch of modern industry. Hershey's factory in Pennsylvania was producing millions of bars per week, integrated into the massive logistical framework of the U.S. Army. Conveyor belts, mechanized wrapping, and quality control ensured that identical bars could be shipped to Europe, Africa, or the Pacific and arrive intact. American soldiers took for granted that a chocolate bar in Normandy tasted the same as one in New York. Germany, by contrast, had redirected its industry toward armaments and fuel. Chocolate production all but ceased. Factories were bombed or converted for military purposes. Skilled labor was drafted. Transport networks were strained. There was no equivalent mass-produced sweet available to soldiers or civilians by 1944. Hershey's chocolate wasn't just food. It was proof of an industrial system capable of sustaining both war and comfort simultaneously. For the nurses, seeing chocolate given out to prisoners, not hoarded for elites, was evidence of something they had been told did not exist: abundance. There was also a tactical logic behind these distributions. The U.S. military adhered closely to the Geneva Convention. POWs were to receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. This policy was both practical and strategic. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to resist, riot, or attempt escape. Fair treatment encouraged cooperation, useful intelligence, and better behavior inside the camps. Giving POWs the same rations as American soldiers wasn't charity. It was part of maintaining order and discipline. Chocolate played its role within that structure: small, controlled, predictable. It humanized the captors without softening the power dynamic. For the German nurses, who came from a regime where prisoners were often starved or brutalized, this treatment carried psychological weight. It blurred the lines between victor and vanquished in unexpected ways. In their hands, the chocolate was both sustenance and a symbol of how differently this enemy fought its war, not only with tanks and planes, but with supply chains, predictability, and a level of generosity that propaganda had assured them was impossible. The story, however, does not end with sweetness. To understand the full depth of this encounter, we must look further at leadership decisions, perceptions of the enemy, and the moral undercurrents shaping both sides. At the highest levels of command, the treatment of German prisoners was a deliberate strategic choice. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, overseeing the Allied campaign in Europe, understood that Germany would eventually have to be rebuilt, not just conquered. Harsh treatment of prisoners might satisfy revenge, but it would fuel resistance and complicate occupation. The U.S. War Department issued strict directives. Axis POWs were to be fed, housed, and treated according to the Geneva Convention. The presence of nurses and medical personnel among the prisoners added another layer. These individuals were not combatants. They were often respected for their skills even by their captors. Allowing them access to standard rations, including chocolate, reinforced a message. The United States fought as a modern, lawful power, not as a mirror of Nazi brutality. For German prisoners, including the nurses, this was disorienting. Many had absorbed years of state propaganda depicting America as chaotic, racially degenerate, and weak. In Nazi newsreels, the United States was shown as a land of jazz, crime, and moral decay, an unserious nation incapable of waging a total war. Yet here they were, standing in a camp where trucks arrived on schedule, food was plentiful, and discipline was professional. The guards were neither brutal nor afraid. The infrastructure around them functioned with clockwork efficiency. The simple act of receiving a chocolate bar from a guard's hand contradicted years of ideology. It wasn't simply a treat. It was a confrontation with a reality their government had hidden. Memoirs and post-war interviews reveal a range of reactions. Some prisoners felt awe at America's abundance. Others grew quiet, uneasy. One former German nurse later recalled that she realized at that moment how much her country had lied to her. If the enemy could afford to give chocolate to its prisoners, she thought, what chance did Germany have left? This psychological shift was subtle but profound. It was not created through speeches or leaflets, but through lived experience, through taste, sight, and routine. Morally, the chocolate became a quiet symbol. It didn't erase the war or the suffering. It didn't forgive atrocities or absolve guilt. But it represented a small, tangible moment in which the human experience crossed enemy lines. For American soldiers, handing out a bar of chocolate was an ordinary act. For the recipients, it could be transformative. These moments chipped away at the ideological walls built over years of propaganda. In some camps, guards noticed a softening among prisoners after such encounters. Discipline improved. Cooperation increased. German nurses, in particular, often found ways to contribute within the camp medical systems. They worked alongside American personnel treating fellow prisoners, and sometimes civilians, with professionalism and care. The chocolate didn't cause this, it accompanied it. A quiet presence in pockets and hands during breaks. A reminder that the world was larger and stranger than the war had allowed them to imagine. By examining leadership decisions, enemy perceptions, and moral layers, we see that this was far more than an anecdote about sweets. It was part of a larger collision between two worlds. One built on scarcity and ideology, the other on industrial strength and calculated adherence to law. This collision would come to a head in the closing months of the war, when POW camps filled to capacity, and the reality of Germany's defeat became undeniable. It is in this moment of collision that the story reaches its decisive turning point by late 1944 and into 1945. The flow of German prisoners to the United States reached its peak. Ships carrying thousands of POWs crossed the Atlantic in convoys, escorted by destroyers through submarine-infested waters. Among them were hundreds of medical personnel, nurses who had been captured during retreats in France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Many had surrendered in organized groups, following wounded soldiers and hospital trains as the front collapsed. When they arrived at ports like Norfolk, Boston, or New York, they stepped into a world that felt unreal. Clean harbors, intact railways, bustling cities untouched by bombing. They were quickly processed through intake centers, fingerprinted, photographed, and assigned to camps inland. For many, this journey led to sprawling compounds in the Midwest, places like Iowa, Wisconsin, or Nebraska. The climate was cold but stable, the landscape vast. Wooden barracks lined up in perfect rows. Barbed wire enclosed the perimeters, but inside, the prisoners encountered a kind of structured normality that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the front. It was during these intake procedures and the first weeks in camp that many German nurses tasted Hershey's chocolate for the first time. The distribution was not ceremonial. It was administrative. Prisoners were issued standardized rations upon arrival: bread, meat, canned goods, coffee, and occasionally a chocolate bar identical to those carried by U.S. soldiers. The chocolate might appear in a mess hall, handed out during orientation, or slipped into daily rations without explanation. For the Americans, it was routine. For the German nurses, it was astonishing. First-hand accounts reveal their reactions. Some unwrapped the foil slowly, suspicious that it was medicine or something laced. Others sniffed it, puzzled by the unfamiliar aroma. A few broke it into small pieces, sharing with those around them. The moment it touched their tongues, a collective murmur spread. Soft laughter, disbelief, questions whispered in German. "Can soldiers eat this every day?" One reportedly asked an interpreter. The answer, yes, seemed almost absurd. For years, these women had lived in a world where sweetness was nearly extinct. German wartime rations were calculated to sustain, not comfort. Chocolate had vanished early in the conflict, replaced by bitter substitutes. To taste something so rich and consistent was to be confronted with a new reality. Some later described the chocolate as almost overwhelming, too sweet compared to what they remembered. Yet it was not merely about flavor. It was about what the chocolate represented. Here they were, prisoners of war in a foreign land, and yet receiving something their own soldiers could not have. It shattered assumptions. Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as soft and morally decayed, incapable of sustaining a real war. But the existence of such abundance in the middle of a global conflict told a different story. Of factories running without interruption, supply lines stretching across oceans, and a home front untouched by devastation. The turning point was not a single event, but a series of quiet realizations. The chocolate was one of the first cracks in a wall built by years of ideology. As nurses continued their daily routines within the camps, this initial moment of disbelief lingered. They watched trucks delivering goods on time. They saw guards well-fed and calm. They experienced order rather than terror, and each of these observations chipped away at the narrative they had once believed. This psychological shift was subtle but powerful. For many, it marked the beginning of an internal reckoning, a sense that the war their leaders had promised was not unfolding as told, and that the enemy they had been taught to despise might, in some ways, be stronger not through brutality, but through stability and abundance. This quiet shift deepened further in the following months, as the war neared its end and POW camps swelled with new arrivals, forcing both prisoners and captors to confront the broader implications of this contrast. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the camps filled to capacity. The Third Reich was collapsing, cities were burning, and entire armies were surrendering. In the United States, trains carrying new POWs arrived almost daily. Among them were more medical personnel, soldiers, and auxiliary staff who had served on fronts now overrun by Allied forces. Inside the camps, routines tightened. The intake of thousands of prisoners required discipline, structure, and unwavering logistics. For the German nurses, the weeks turned into months. They settled into patterns: morning roll calls, work assignments in infirmaries or kitchens, evening counts. They learned English words from guards and other prisoners. They witnessed the immense organizational machine of the United States in motion. Trucks arrived on schedule with food. Supplies were distributed with efficiency. Medical care for the sick was provided promptly, sometimes with equipment superior to what they had known in Germany. It was in this extended period that the meaning of that first taste of chocolate deepened. The chocolate had not been a one-time curiosity. It appeared periodically, part of a system so consistent it almost felt impersonal. In the mess halls, on special occasions, or in regular rations, the same neat bars appeared, wrapped identically, unchanging. Over time, the initial disbelief turned into a kind of quiet respect. The prisoners began to understand that this was not a gesture. It was infrastructure. Many German nurses later described this period as a slow unraveling of the image they had held of the enemy. Their propaganda had shown America as divided and decadent, incapable of sustained effort. But what they experienced was the opposite: a society that could wage total war abroad while maintaining abundance at home. The chocolate became emblematic of this revelation. Its sweetness was proof of a machine that worked flawlessly behind the front lines. Interviews and memoirs collected after the war reveal how these encounters changed perceptions. Some nurses admitted that they began to doubt the inevitability of German victory long before official news reached them. The steady supply of food and goods in captivity made it clear: if a nation could afford to give prisoners chocolate while fighting across two oceans, its strength was of a different order. For American personnel, this psychological impact was not fully planned but well understood. U.S. military, intelligence, and the War Department knew that fair treatment of POWs could undermine enemy morale more effectively than brutality. Leaflets dropped over German lines often hinted at good treatment in captivity. But the reality of it, the routine, the abundance, the chocolate, was far more persuasive than any message from the sky. Some prisoners wrote letters home through the Red Cross, describing camp life. Though censored, a few managed to convey glimpses of what they saw. Families in Germany facing starvation and bombings read descriptions of POWs receiving food and chocolate in American camps. The contrast was stark. It planted seeds of doubt in places propaganda had once dominated. This turning point was not dramatic. It had no explosions, no grand speeches. It unfolded quietly day by day in barracks and mess halls through routines and rations. It was psychological rather than physical. A realization that the war's outcome had already been decided, not only by armies on the battlefield, but by the sheer weight of industrial and logistical power. And at the center of that realization, for many nurses, was a small brown square of chocolate that told them more about their captors than any weapon ever could. In the months that followed, the guns would fall silent, and the prisoners would face an uncertain future. But the impressions formed in these camps would travel back across the Atlantic with them, shaping how they remembered both defeat and the enemy who had triumphed. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the war in Europe came to an abrupt but devastating end. Cities lay in ruins. Transportation networks were shattered. Food supplies were critically low. Millions of civilians wandered through the rubble searching for shelter, and returning soldiers found a homeland transformed almost beyond recognition. For the German nurses held in American camps, the news of capitulation arrived in guarded announcements and whispered conversations. There were no radio celebrations for them, just a shift in atmosphere. The guards became less tense. The routines continued, but everyone knew the world outside the fences had changed. They were no longer prisoners of a war in progress. They were captives of a defeated regime. The U.S. military began the long process of repatriation. Returning hundreds of thousands of German POWs was a massive logistical effort that stretched into 1946. Priority was given to medical personnel and non-combatants. The nurses, classified as auxiliary staff, were often among the first to be processed for return. But transportation took time. Ships had to be refitted, routes coordinated, and the situation in occupied Germany stabilized. During these months, many nurses reflected on what they had experienced. In interviews conducted years later, some spoke of those quiet, strange moments in the camps when their view of the world shifted. The chocolate encounter was not forgotten. For many, it became a personal marker, something simple, tangible, that encapsulated a larger realization. It was not about indulgence. It was about witnessing a level of organization and plenty that stood in shocking contrast to their memories of scarcity and collapse. When the nurses finally boarded ships back to Europe, they carried few belongings. Their uniforms had long been confiscated. Their identities were recorded, but their memories traveled with them, etched deeply by months of captivity. Upon arrival in a shattered Germany, they were confronted with hunger, black markets, and cities that barely functioned. Food rationing continued well after the war. Chocolate remained a rare luxury. Stories began to circulate quietly. Families gathered around those who had returned, eager to hear what life in American captivity had been like. And there, among tales of clean barracks and orderly routines, came the stories of chocolate, of bars handed out to prisoners, of sweetness that seemed impossible in wartime. These stories spread not through propaganda but through personal testimony. In a country starved of hope, they hinted at another world. Some of the nurses resumed their medical work in post-war hospitals. Others returned to civilian life, but many carried forward an image of the United States shaped not only by military power, but by the quiet efficiency and abundance they had witnessed firsthand. The memory of that first chocolate encounter lingered, often mentioned decades later in memoirs and oral histories as a symbol of their captivity's most unexpected lesson. The aftermath of the war would see this symbol grow far beyond POW camps. In the years following the war, chocolate would take on an even larger symbolic role in the relationship between Germany and the United States. As the defeated nation struggled to rebuild amid ruins, American influence arrived not only through military occupation, but through material culture, food, goods, and the spectacle of abundance. Nowhere was this more dramatically displayed than during the Berlin airlift of 1948-1949. When the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, American and British aircraft supplied the city with everything from coal to medicine. Among the most memorable moments was the spontaneous initiative of U.S. pilot Gail Halvorson, who began dropping small parachutes of candy and chocolate to German children during his flights. His act captured global attention. Soon, tons of sweets were included in official deliveries, and Berliners began calling him Uncle Wiggly Wings. For many Germans, especially children who had grown up in scarcity, these candy drops carried profound emotional weight. Chocolate became a symbol of hope, generosity, and the arrival of a new kind of world. The same industrial power that had overwhelmed Germany during the war was now feeding its children from the skies. The contrast with the starvation years of the war could not have been more striking. Hershey's played a quiet but steady role in this transformation. During the occupation, American PX stores and aid programs distributed chocolate and other consumer goods widely. German civilians encountered American products through aid packages, black markets, and direct interactions with occupying forces. For many, these goods represented not merely luxury, but the tangible presence of a modern, functioning society. For the German nurses who had once been POWs, this period must have felt like the widening of an experience that had begun behind barbed wire. What they had first tasted in captivity, something almost unbelievable, was now being tasted by children in the streets of Berlin. What had once been a symbol of shock and dissonance became a shared cultural memory between former enemies. American policy during the Marshall Plan years deliberately encouraged this. Economic aid was paired with cultural influence, and everyday items like chocolate, chewing gum, and canned goods became unofficial ambassadors of a new alliance. German society, while recovering from trauma and grappling with guilt, began to associate these symbols not with occupation, but with reconstruction and modernity. By the 1950s, Hershey's chocolate bars were no longer alien objects to many Germans. They appeared in shops, aid parcels, and cultural exchanges. But for those who had first encountered them in POW camps, the memory remained layered, sweetness intertwined with surrender, captivity, and the first real glimpses of America's power. The aftermath of that wartime encounter stretched far beyond a single moment. It became part of a larger story: how small, human experiences can echo through decades of political, cultural, and psychological change. It is in this echo that the story finds its quiet conclusion. War is often remembered through its battles, its weapons, and its leaders. But history also lives in smaller moments, in the taste of something unfamiliar, in the quiet space between surrender and understanding. For the German nurses who found themselves in distant American camps, a single square of Hershey's chocolate became one of those moments. It was not a grand gesture. It was routine, almost mechanical, handed out by guards who likely didn't think twice about it. Yet for the recipients, it marked a rupture in their world. It revealed that the enemy they had been taught to despise could feed its prisoners better than their own army fed its soldiers. It revealed a system so vast and efficient that even sweetness flowed through its supply lines in the middle of total war. That realization was more powerful than any speech. It did not arrive through propaganda, but through experience, through sight, smell, and taste. The chocolate became a bridge between two realities: the collapsing world of the Reich and the industrial abundance of the United States. In that moment, ideology cracked and perception shifted. In the years after the war, the memory of that sweetness lingered. It reappeared in conversations, memoirs, and cultural exchanges. It echoed in the candy drops over Berlin, in the aid packages of the Marshall Plan, in the slow intertwining of former enemies into allies. A simple bar of chocolate had traveled from factory floors in Pennsylvania to battlefields, to prison camps, and finally into memory. History often turns on quiet hinges. For these women, the hinge was not a battlefield but a taste, one that revealed the scale of a world they had never truly known. And in that fleeting moment of sweetness, something larger than victory or defeat was revealed: the power of everyday things to expose the deeper truths of war and the worlds it creates.